$7 and a skinning knife. That was what a man's conscience cost him, in the frozen mud of Buckhorn Gulch. And Orin hadn't planned on spending either. He'd come down from the sawtooths for lamp oil, cornmeal, and enough .44 cartridges to last through March. He hadn't come to buy a woman, but the sound of her skull hitting the tailgate of that freight wagon changed the arithmetic of his afternoon. The man they called Tallow, a grease-skinned teamster with a voice like a cracked church bell, had her by the hair. She was kneeling in the wagon bed, wrists lashed behind her back, with rawhide strips pulled so tight. Her fingers had gone the color of old wax. Her dress was made from a grain sack, the stenciled letters of a Boise flour mill still legible across her stomach. She was young, maybe 25, though the bruises aging her face made it hard to tell. What Orin noticed first was her mouth. It was shut. Not pressed closed in defiance or clamped down in fear. Just shut, the way you'd close a door on a room you never planned to enter again. She cooks, she hauls. She don't scream no more, Tallow announced, jerking her head back so the gathered miners could see her face. A string of dried blood ran from her nose to her upper lip. $15 takes the whole package. Bill of sale, a set of mending needles, and a wool blanket I'll throw in, because I'm a Christian. Somebody laughed. Somebody else threw a walnut shell that bounced off her shoulder. She didn't react. She was somewhere else entirely, locked inside a stillness so absolute it made Orin's stomach turn. He'd trapped wolverines that fought harder than this. He'd watched elk with arrows in their lungs still try to run. Whatever this girl had been through, it had burned the fight out of her so completely that she wasn't even pretending anymore. Orin shifted the heavy canvas sack of cornmeal on his shoulder. Walk away. It wasn't his business. He had a 12-mile climb ahead of him and a storm building over the western ridge that would turn the trail into a death sentence by nightfall. Walk away. 10, a miner with a missing thumb called out. But only 'cause my last one run off. Tallow grinned, showing a row of teeth stained the color of tobacco juice. She won't run. I cut the tendons in her left foot 6 months back. She can walk, but she ain't fast. The air left Orin's chest like he'd been kicked by a mule. He dropped the cornmeal. He crossed the muddy street in 4 strides, the frozen slush cracking under his boots like breaking bones. The crowd parted. Orin stood 6'3", broad enough to block a doorway, and he smelled like bear grease, wood smoke, and the kind of solitude that made civilized men uneasy. He didn't climb onto the wagon. He reached up, pulled the skinning knife from his belt, a beautiful piece of hammered steel with a handle carved from black walnut, and laid it on the tailgate beside 7 silver dollars. Every coin he had. 7 and the blade, Orin said. His voice came out flat, scraped clean of everything except the words themselves. Tallow looked at the knife. It was worth more than the silver. The handle alone would fetch $12 in any trading post west of the divide. He reached for it. Touch her again after the money changes hands, Orin said quietly, and I'll take the knife back the hard way. Tallow's hand stopped. He looked up at Orin's face, searching for the bluff, and found nothing but granite. He scooped up the coins and the blade, stuffing them into his coat. She's yours, mountain man. Don't say I didn't warn you about the foot. Orin pulled himself onto the wagon bed. The girl didn't move. She was staring at a point somewhere in the middle distance, her breathing shallow and mechanical. He drew his belt knife, a rougher, uglier tool than the one he'd just traded, and cut the rawhide binding her wrists. The strips fell away, leaving raw grooves in her skin that wept a thin, watery fluid. Can you stand? She looked at her freed hands as if they belonged to someone else. Slowly, she pressed her palms flat against the splintered wood and pushed herself up. Her left foot turned inward at an unnatural angle, and she swayed, but she stood. My horse is across the street. Walk if you can. I'll carry you if you can't. She walked. It was a lurching, dragging gait that made every step look like a negotiation with pain, but she walked. She didn't look back at Tallow. She didn't look at Orin. She looked at the ground directly in front of her feet, navigating the frozen ruts with the careful precision of someone who had learned that falling down in public invited worse things than mud. Orin retrieved his cornmeal, lashed it to the pack frame, and swung up onto his bay gelding. He reached down. She stared at his hand for a long moment, then took it. He pulled her up behind the saddle. She was horrifyingly light. 90 pounds of bone and scar tissue wrapped in a flour sack. "Hold on to the cantle," he said. "Don't grab me." He felt her fingers find the back rim of the saddle. She gripped it like a drowning woman, gripping driftwood. They climbed. The trail switchbacked through stands of lodgepole pine so dense the sky disappeared. The temperature dropped 10 degrees for every 1,000 feet of elevation. By the time they reached the first bench, the freezing rain had turned to sleet, driving sideways into their faces like handfuls of thrown glass. Orin could feel her shaking behind him. Not the ordinary shiver of cold, but a deep, racking tremor that came from somewhere below the muscles, below the bones, from the place where the body stores the things the mind refuses to carry. She didn't speak. He didn't expect her to. He wasn't a man who trusted words. Words were what tallow used. Words were what men in towns used to dress up ugly transactions and make cruelty sound reasonable. Up here, things either kept you alive or they killed you. And none of them required a speech. The cabin materialized out of the storm like a bruise on the mountainside. Low, square, built from unpeeled cedar logs he'd dragged up the ridge 3 summers ago. The roof was sod and snow. The door was a single slab of hand-hewn pine. No windows. Windows were a luxury that invited wind. He dismounted, pulled her down, and pointed. "Inside. I'll deal with the horse." She limped to the door, pushed it open, and disappeared into the darkness. Orin took his time with the gelding. He rubbed the animal down with a handful of dry grass, checked its hooves, fed it a measure of oats from the dwindling supply. He was stalling, and he knew it. The horse didn't judge him. The horse didn't need anything explained. He pressed his forehead against the animal's warm neck and breathed. "What have you done?" The cabin was black inside, colder than the air outside, because the stone and log held the chill like a fist. Orin struck a sulfur match. The flare showed him her, standing exactly where she'd stopped, dead center of the room, arms wrapped around herself, water pooling at her feet. She hadn't touched anything. She hadn't moved. He lit the kerosene lamp. He built a fire in the cast iron stove, feeding it with shaved cedar kindling until the wood caught and the first wave of heat pushed back against the cold. He opened a tin of salt pork and set a pan on the stovetop. "What's your name?" "Rue." Her voice was a scraped whisper, like someone had taken sandpaper to her vocal cords. "I'm Orin. Sit down." She looked at the single chair. She looked at the dirt floor. She sat on the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, making herself as small as the room would allow. The pork fat began to sizzle. The smell filled the cabin. Rich, salty, unbearably human. Rue's stomach made a sound like a rusted hinge. Orin scraped the meat onto a tin plate and set it on the floor in front of her. She stared at it. "I haven't done anything yet. It's food, Rue. It doesn't require a transaction." She picked up a piece of pork with her fingers. She didn't eat it. She held it to her nose, inhaling the smell, her eyes closing. Then she placed it carefully in the pocket of her grain sack dress. "Eat it. I will, later, when I know the rules." Orin lowered himself to the floor across from her, his back against the log wall. He packed his pipe, a battered clay thing he'd carried for 10 years, and lit it. The tobacco smoke curled toward the ceiling, mixing with the cedar. There are no rules. There are always rules. He looked at her through the haze. Her hazel eyes were open but empty, like windows in an abandoned house. "The last man," she said carefully, as if selecting each word from a shelf. He had rules. Work from dawn. No food until the work was done. If the work wasn't done right, no food the next day either. The one before him had different rules. I don't need to describe them. She paused. Tallow's rules were the simplest. Stay quiet, stay useful, Don't bleed on the merchandise. Orin's pipe had gone out. He didn't relight it. I'm not asking for kindness, Orin. She said his name like she was testing the weight of a stone before throwing it. I'm asking for clarity. I have a bad foot. I can work, but I'm slow. When I stop being worth the food I eat, do you put me out in the snow, or do you sell me down in the spring? I just need to know the calendar so I can plan. She said it the way a person discusses weather. A practical matter, a scheduling concern. She was asking him to outline the terms of her disposal, and she was doing it without a single tremor in her voice, because she had asked this question before, and the answer had never been good, and she had survived anyway. Orin set the pipe on the floor. He stood up. The sudden motion made her flinch. A full body recoil that pressed her spine flat against the wall. He walked to the stove, gripped the iron poker, and shoved it into the fire, hard enough to send a shower of sparks screaming up the flue. Nobody gets put out in the snow, he said, his back to her. His voice so low it was almost swallowed by the crackle of burning wood. Nobody gets sold. You eat when there's food. You sleep in that bed. He pointed without turning. You want to leave in the spring. I'll give you the horse, and whatever provisions I can spare. You want to stay. You stay. But there is no ledger in this cabin. There is no calendar. And if you ask me one more time when I'm planning to kill you, I am going to lose my temper. And the only thing that's going to suffer is this stove. He slammed the iron door shut. The clang echoed off the walls. Behind him, silence. Then the soft, tentative crinkle of her pulling the pork from her pocket, the wet sound of chewing. He closed his eyes and listened to her eat. The first week passed in a silence so thick it felt architectural. Orin left before dawn to check his trap lines. He returned at dark. Rue existed in the spaces between. She fed the fire. She swept the dirt floor with a bundle of pine boughs. She sorted his ammunition by caliber, without being asked. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, leaving no trace except the fire still burning and the coffee pot still warm. She slept in the bed. He slept on the floor. Neither of them mentioned the arrangement. On the 8th day, the blizzard hit. It came screaming down from the continental divide like something, alive and furious, burying the cabin under 4 feet of snow in 12 hours. The temperature plummeted to 30 below. The world outside ceased to exist. They were trapped together in 200 square feet of frozen air. Orin sat at the table, mending a torn beaver pelt with a heavy needle. Rue sat by the stove, her bad foot stretched toward the heat, darning a hole in one of his wool socks. The wind shrieked. The logs groaned. "How did you end up with tallow?" Orin asked. He hadn't planned to say it. The words just fell out of him, pushed by the pressure of the silence. Rue's needle stopped. She was quiet for so long he thought she wasn't going to answer. My father owed money to a man in Lewiston, the kind of money that doesn't have numbers. He paid it with me. I was 17. She pulled the thread through the wool, her hand perfectly steady. The man in Lewiston sold me to a ranch outfit near Salmon City. They sold me to a logging camp. The logging camp sold me to tallow every time the price went down. A pause. Tallow got me for $3 and a bottle of rye. He had me for 2 years. Orin stared at the beaver pelt. His vision had gone slightly red at the edges. "The foot," he said. "I tried to run. The 2nd week." She pulled the sock over her hand, examining her work. "He used a hatchet." He said he was being merciful because a bullet would have been a waste. The needle in Orin's hand snapped. He looked down at the 2 pieces of broken steel in his palm, then carefully set them on the table. He stood, put on his coat, and went outside into the blizzard. He stood in the howling wind until his face went numb, and the red at the edges of his vision faded to white. When he came back in, his beard crusted with ice, Rue was still darning. She looked up at him. "I didn't tell you that so you'd feel sorry for me," she said quietly. "I told you so you'd stop being careful around me. I can see you thinking about where you step. You don't have to. I'm not going to shatter." Orin hung his coat on the peg. He sat back down. He picked up a new needle. "I'll stop being careful," he said, "when you stop hiding food in your pockets." She almost smiled. It wasn't a smile, exactly. More like the shadow of one, the memory of a muscle that hadn't been used in years. But it cracked something open in the room, and after that, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a shared language. Spring didn't come. It pretended to, twice. A day of sunshine that melted the top crust, followed by a night of brutal cold that turned the mountainside into a sheet of glass. On the second false thaw, Rue convinced Orin to let her check the near trap line while he worked on repairing the sod roof. She'd been gone 3 hours when the sky turned black. The storm hit without warning. A late-season squall that dropped 2 feet of wet, heavy snow in 90 minutes. Orin stood on the porch, his heart hammering, staring into the white void. She was out there with a bad foot, no rifle, and a sense of direction she'd learned from 8 weeks on a mountain she still barely knew. He grabbed his coat, his rifle, and the kerosene lantern. He followed her tracks until the fresh snow buried them. Then he followed his gut. He found her in a ravine a half-mile east, wedged between 2 boulders, where she'd crawled to escape the wind. She was conscious but hypothermic, her lips blue-gray, her words slurring into nonsense. Her bad foot had given out on an ice shelf, and she'd tumbled 15 feet into the drainage. Her left arm hung at an angle that made Orin's jaw clench. He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her. He lifted her. Still impossibly light, still nothing but willpower and bone, and carried her against his chest, shielding her from the wind with his own body. The half-mile back to the cabin took 2 hours. By the time he kicked the door open, his hands were so numb he couldn't feel his fingers, and she had stopped shivering, which was worse. He stripped her wet clothes off. He didn't look at her body. He wrapped her in every blanket and pelt he owned, and laid her on the bed. He built the fire until the stove glowed red. He set her dislocated shoulder. She screamed, the first loud sound she had ever made in his presence, and bound it tight with strips of torn flannel. The fever came that night. It hit like a freight train, sending her temperature so high that the sweat evaporated off her skin almost instantly. She thrashed. She talked. The things she said in her delirium were worse than anything she'd told him while conscious. "Don't let him take the hatchet, please. I'll be good. I won't run. Tell him I won't run again." Orin sat beside the bed, his massive hands hanging useless between his knees. He listened to the wreckage of her past pour out of her like water from a broken dam. "Sissy's still in Lewiston. She's only 12, please. I'll go back. Just don't sell Sissy." A sister. She had a sister somewhere. Orin reached out and laid his hand flat on her forehead. She was burning. He soaked rags in snowmelt and draped them across her neck, her wrists, her ankles. He brewed willow bark tea so bitter it made his eyes water, and he spooned it past her cracked lips every hour through the night. He didn't sleep for 3 days. He talked to her. The most words he'd spoken in 5 years. A rambling, desperate monologue about nothing and everything. He told her about the elk he'd seen on the ridge last autumn, how it stood in the fog like a cathedral. He told her about the sound the creek made in July when the snowmelt hit the granite. He told her that the coffee was getting low and she needed to wake up so they could argue about whether to ration it or drink it all at once. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Rue opened her eyes. They were clear, exhausted, and absolutely furious. "You let the fire die," she whispered. Orin looked at the stove. The coals were grey. He started laughing, a horrible, cracked, desperate sound that he couldn't stop. He dropped his head into his hands and laughed until his shoulders shook and his eyes burned, and something that might have been a sob got tangled up in the middle of it. "Don't you ever do that to me again," he said. Rue watched him from the bed, her eyes wide. She had never seen him lose control of anything. She reached out with her good arm and touched his wrist, just 2 fingers resting lightly on his pulse. "I came back," she said softly. "You almost didn't, but I did." She paused. "That's the part that counts." The recovery was slow. Rue's shoulder healed, but her left arm never regained full strength. She adapted. She learned to split kindling with one hand bracing the hatchet and the other guiding the log. She learned to set snares using her teeth to hold the wire while her fingers worked the loop. Orin watched her solve every problem her body threw at her with a grim, systematic patience that humbled him. He started teaching her things, not because she never asked, but because he caught her watching him. She watched how he read the snow for animal tracks. She watched how he dressed a rabbit, where he cut what he kept. She watched how he loaded the rifle, how he sighted it, how he breathed before he pulled the trigger. One afternoon he handed her the rifle. Rue took it. She looked at the weapon, then at him, the same flicker of old panic, a weapon in close quarters, a man standing over her. But she swallowed it. She raised the stock to her shoulder, her bad arm trembling under the weight. "Breathe out," Orin said. "Squeeze, don't pull." She fired. The recoil knocked her back a step. The bullet hit a pine tree 40 yards out, spraying bark. "Again," Orin said. She fired again, closer to the blaze he'd carved on the trunk. "Good." It was the first time he'd praised her. She didn't smile, but she chambered the next round with a certainty in her hands that hadn't been there before. The real spring finally came in late May. The snow retreated up the mountain like a tide going out, revealing a world of mud, new grass, and wildflowers so vivid they hurt to look at. The creek behind the cabin swelled with snowmelt, roaring day and night. Orin was standing on the porch, watching the sun set behind the jagged western peaks. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. The air smelled of pine sap, wet earth, and something sweet he couldn't name. Rue came out. She was wearing a skirt she'd sewn from a wool blanket, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her hair, clean, dark blonde, longer now, tied back with a strip of leather. She looked like a different person from the hollow-eyed wraith he'd pulled off that wagon in Buckhorn Gulch. She looked like someone who lived here. She leaned against the porch rail beside him. For a while neither of them spoke. The creek filled the silence. "Trail's clear," Orin said. "Stage runs out of Warren on Thursdays. You could make it by Wednesday night." Rue didn't answer. She reached into the pocket of her skirt and pulled something out. She set it on the railing between them. It was a knife, a skinning knife with a handle carved from black walnut. Orin stared at it. His blood went cold, then hot, then something he didn't have a name for. "Where did you get that?" "Tallow's saddlebag," Rue said, her voice steady. "The night you bought me. You went to deal with the horse." "I went back." He was drunk, passed out in the wagon. "Your knife was in his coat pocket. I took it and hid it in the grain sack I was wearing." She had gone back. Into the dark, on a mangled foot, she had gone back to the man who had crippled her. Not to kill him, not to run, to retrieve the thing Orin had sacrificed for her. "I could have sold it," she said. "In any town between here and Boise, that knife is worth enough for a stage ticket and 3 weeks in a boarding house. I could have left the first time you went to check the traps. I could have taken the horse. Why didn't you?" Rue picked up the knife and held it out to him, handle first. The black walnut gleamed in the last of the daylight. "Because I wasn't looking for an escape, Orin. I was looking for a reason to stop running." He took the knife. The handle fit his palm exactly the way it always had, worn smooth by 10 years of use. But it felt different now. Heavier. Warmer. "The debt's paid," Rue said. $7 and a skinning knife. I'm giving back the knife. I'll work off the silver by next winter." She swallowed. "After that, there's nothing between us, except whatever we decide there is." Orin turned the knife over in his hand. He slid it back into the empty sheath on his belt, where it had left a gap he'd felt every day for 8 months. "And what do you want there to be?" he asked, his voice rough as river gravel. Rue looked out at the valley. The last light was dying on the peaks, turning the snow to gold. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but there was no tremor in it, no fear, no negotiation, just a woman standing on solid ground for the first time in her life, asking a question she already knew the answer to. "I want to be here when the snow comes back, not because you bought me, not because I owe you, Because this porch is the first place I've ever stood where nobody's coming to drag me away. She turned to face him. But only if you want me here, Orin. Not out of pity, not out of habit. I need to hear you say it. The mountain man looked at her. He looked at the bruised sky, the dark timber, the cabin he had built with his own hands for a life he had designed around solitude. He had spent 10 years convincing himself that alone was the same thing as safe. She had spent 10 years learning that survival without choice was just a slower way to die. They were both wrong, and they both knew it, and the knowing was terrifying, and the terrifying was the whole point. Orin set his cane against the rail. He reached out, and for the first time, he touched her face, his rough, scarred hand cupping her jaw with a gentleness that cost him everything he had. "Stay," he said. The word broke open in his chest like the first crack of spring ice on the river. "God help me, Rue. Stay." She covered his hand with hers. She closed her eyes. And in the blue dusk of the Sawtooth Mountains, with the creek roaring and the first stars burning cold and bright above the timberline, she leaned into him, and he held her, and neither of them let go. The wind came down off the peaks, carrying the smell of snow still clinging to the high country. But on the porch of the cedar cabin, the winter was already a memory, and the woman who had been bought for $7 and a skinning knife was finally, irreversibly, free.